We are excited to have presenting today Jasmine Ramirez-Strain. Jasmine has been the Pesticide Safety Education Program PSEP Coordinator with UC IPM since July of 2023. In this role, she develops educational resources, coordinates training sessions, and facilitates outreach efforts to promote safe pesticide use among agricultural, non-ag professionals, and the general public. Thank you for joining us today, Jasmine. You can go ahead and start sharing your screen.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, thank you so much for that introduction, Lauren, and well, thank you everyone for being here today. For the next hour or so, or I guess 45 minutes, I will be discussing the basics of personal protective equipment. And what I'm hoping to cover in today's talk is a broad definition of what personal protective equipment is, the importance of wearing PPE. We're going to discuss the health effects that pesticides pose on a person, as well as the common routes of exposure. And we're going to talk about it more in the specifics of home use products and some of the hazardous chemicals that we may encounter. And we're going to talk about resources and recommendations of personal protective equipment for specific situations. And last but not least, we're going to talk about what to do after you're done with the pesticide application and what are the recommended decontamination steps. So PPE stands for personal protective equipment. And these are typically protective devices that are or were developed for minimizing and mitigating exposure of pesticides on a body of a person. Typically, these are pesticide applicators. And so it is also the main function is to prevent serious injuries and illnesses to people due to pesticide exposure. Typically, we're going to find personal protective equipment requirements on the product label. However, this might not be the case always, and as we're going to find out later throughout the presentation, but these are the basics. So, personal protective equipment, as I mentioned, it's protective devices, right? And so there are different types, and they're pretty self-explanatory, but they can be clumped into different sections to emphasize the different parts of the body that they protect. For example, if we have this safety goggles, face shields, and safety glasses, and they're going to protect, well, our eyes and part of our skin or part of the face. Then we have the nose, the respirators, which protect nose and mouth. And we also have things such as chemical resistant aprons, chemical resistant shoes, which are these boots that we see here, coveralls, and chemical resistant gloves, which protect overall the entire body and therefore the skin. So having gone through that very brief introduction of what PPE is and the different types, and I will be discussing in more detail each one of these later on, but I wanted to start off with giving a very broad overview of PPE. Now we're going to move on to why we have access to PPE, what PPE exists, the importance of wearing it. And that's because, as I mentioned, they were developed to protect applicators from exposure. And pretty much for some of you, this information might be brand new. For some of you, it might be already old news. But we know that there are 4 routes of exposure to pesticides for applicators, and even maybe for bystanders or people that work in areas where pesticides are applied. Typically, pesticides and pesticide residues will enter via eyes, nose, mouth, and the skin. And so maybe at a pesticide safety training that you have attended in the past or other presentations that you have attended, you might get the question, which way is the more common for pesticides to enter the body? And this will be the skin. The skin is our largest organ in our body. We're covered by it, right? So there are multiple pores in our body that are available for any substance to enter. So typically within the pesticide application context, the skin is the most common organ where a pesticide may enter the body. So now that we know that we have those routes of exposure to pesticides or even residues, you might not have to handle the pesticide yourself, but you may come into contact via residues if a pesticide was applied in an area. We have 3 different body parts in this picture here. And this is to signify that skin absorption is different depending on the area that the pesticide may come into contact with. So we have the hand, which is typically a thicker skin on your body. So there might not be as many pores available. And so the rate of absorption of residues might be much slower or a little less. Whereas the skin found on your face is going to tend to be a little bit thinner and more pores are available because we tend to sweat more from those areas. And so if a person touches their surface or goes into a place where pesticides were applied and they were not wearing the correct PPE, they might come into contact with pesticides, and then they touch their face, they might be introducing residues to the face. And then we have our most sensitive areas, which are the private areas of a person, which is, has multiple negative effects to introducing pesticide residues to those areas. It can end in those long-lasting health effects, such as harm to the reproductive parts, infertility, that sort of thing. So oftentimes, myself as a pesticide educator, I would always emphasize, especially for people that work in areas where pesticides are applied, that it's crucial to wash your hands constantly with soap and water and have access to those decontamination supplies, because especially in the day-to-day life, we are used to washing our hands after using the restroom, but not before using the restroom. So having the information of how the residues are absorbed throughout the skin is really going to send that message that it's extremely important to wash your hands thoroughly with soap and water. Okay, now I'd like to switch gears a little bit, more into a little more of a technical aspect, and it's that it's important to define what pesticides are. Even if this talk is about PPE and not necessarily about pesticides as a whole, everything is connected, and it's always a good reminder to know that pesticides are substances used to kill, repel, manage, or prevent a pest. So typically pesticides are registered through the EPA and go through a regulatory process. However, sometimes they're not registered through the EPA and they're known as 25B products or have some other exemptions. But I like to remind people that a substance becomes a pesticide depending on its intended use. So typically we hear oftentimes about the example of using vinegar as a pesticide. Even though it might not be labeled as a pesticide, it becomes a pesticide once you start using it for killing weeds, or in the sense for example, for bleach, right? It's a cleaning household product and it's not really known as a pesticide, but it kills viruses and bacteria, and those are pests to us. So it's considered a pesticide. Okay, so with that in mind, I would like to move into discussing how pesticides affect a person's body. So the probability on how your body will react and how a pesticide affects a person's health depends on a couple different things. So there's multiple factors to consider, such as the type of pesticide, right? The toxicity of the pesticide, what risks the pesticide poses, the age of the person, the health of the person as well. And as well as the amount of pesticide and the length of pesticide of time that a person was exposed to that chemical. So typically, and it is well known that in general, children, elderly people, pregnant women are going to have a more severe reaction to a pesticide. So the same amount of pesticide will affect the person differently depending on these factors, right? And that's something to keep in mind. It's not, I'm going to be making a lot of general statements, but when it comes to pesticide poisoning or events where a person is exposed to a pesticide, it's always good to keep in mind that they are that these factors come into play. Okay, so now that we talked about the differences between or the factors that affect your health, we're going to talk about what are those health effects. What should you be looking for in a person that was exposed to a pesticide, indirectly or directly? And so you're going to be looking for two main type of health effects, which are acute health effects and the chronic health effects. And a lot of people are familiar with these two concepts, but typically acute health effects are those that are going to become apparent very soon after the exposure to a pesticide. If a person is sprayed with a pesticide by accident or a spill happens, typically you're going to be encountering those effects right away. Whereas chronic health effects are those that are going to become apparent in the long term, not necessarily within 20 to 48 hours. It's going to be after small repeated doses of pesticides over time. And we're going to talk about what those are in a minute. There is also another term that people need to be aware of when it comes to health effects and pesticides. It's known as sensitization. I have a hard time pronouncing that word. It's a little hard to say it in one run, but this pretty much means that a person can become allergic to a pesticide. Maybe that person didn't present any acute sign or symptoms when the first time they came into contact with it. But once they are exposed to that pesticide over time, they might come and have a reaction to it. And typically these are skin allergies, that sort of thing. Another concept to be familiar with is the delayed effects, and these are related to the acute symptoms and signs. They become apparent 24 to 48 hours later, and that's why they're known as delayed effects, because typically an acute health effect should be apparent within hours or minutes of an exposure, but they could also be delayed 20 to 48 hours. So what are those acute health effects? Typically, we see symptoms and signs such as shortness of breath, vomit, stomach pain, blurry vision, headaches, diarrhea, crying of the eyes. It's a broad range of health effects that become apparent. And so those are known as acute. And typically, there are, depending again on the toxicity of the pesticide, on the risks that pesticide poses, it could be fatal within minutes, or they could be, if that person has access to medical supervision, then they can treat those symptoms. But acute health effects also are known as, could be fatal and end up in severe negative circumstances. Whereas chronic health effects, those are not going to become apparent right away. As we stated earlier, they're going to be demonstrated later on over a long period of time. And this happens because, as I mentioned, this person gets exposed to a pesticide on repeated times, and that exposure to pesticide accumulates in the person's body, in the person's organs, and it could result in illnesses such as cancers, reproductive infertility, harm, disruption to endocrine system, for example, among other illnesses. And this is important to know, right? Because it's already giving us the message that PPE plays a big role when it comes to handling pesticides. Additionally, this is data from the Department of Pesticide Regulations from their Pesticide Surveillance Illness Program, PISP, I think it stands for. In the past 3 to 4 years, they receive all the data that is related to pesticide exposure events where it results in an illness. And so in the past 2 years, this is data from 2021, 2022, and 2023, they found out that 55% of handler illnesses involved eye injury. 28% were related to skin injury. And out of all those pesticide illnesses and events that were reported to the county and the state, it was found out that 32% could have been avoided if the person was wearing the correct personal protective equipment. So in the state of California, as I'm going to discuss in the upcoming slides, there are regulatory requirements for employees and people that work in areas where pesticides are applied, but this also could be applicable to people that are not necessarily an employee, but they're applying pesticides in their own property. It's also known that failure to wear the correct PPE is a very common violation. People tend to get annoyed for having to wear an extra set of things, especially in a work setting, or if it's a really hot day, they rather not have to have extra things on their body. But as we know now, that this is actual hazards and risks that happen, and it's not just something that it's based on theory, but it's actually based on actual events. So people should be wearing their PPE. And most accidents happen when people are opening or mixing or loading a pesticide, because typically in the professional use of pesticides, they're going to be in a very concentrated form. So high concentration of the active ingredient. And so when they're opening or transporting pesticides, that's when the pesticide might be in its most pure concentrated form, and that would result in that can result in accidents and severe accidents if a person comes, if they open a pesticide container and it spills on them, or if they're not following the proper precautions. Another way of how pesticide events or accidents happen is by storing liquids or chemicals in improper containers, right? So we have a picture here of a child. Thankfully, this isn't happening as often anymore, but it's still a very possible scenario. So storing pesticides in food containers is a big no-no. It's against the law, and it should never be done. And for handlers and people that work in where pesticides are applied, generally agricultural settings, as well as some structural and landscape settings, for example, and they enter an area where a restricted entry interval is in place and they're not wearing the right PPE, they could be exposing themselves to residues or in more fatal cases, acute toxicities, right? So being poisoned that way. So now that we discussed the importance and the main routes of how pesticides enter the body and what are those health effects and how they present on a person's body, I'm going to talk about maybe a scenario that's more applicable to people in residential areas, people in their own homes or the residences. And typically we consider that home residents or gardeners, if you're not in a professional setting, if it's not really for a workplace, you're going to have access to what is known ready-to-use products. So these are your typical pesticides that you might be able to have access to at Ace Hardware or Home Depot, and everyone is able to acquire them. Other household products that are not typically known as pesticides could be bleach or mold removers, mildew removers. And it's good to keep in mind that even though these are not necessarily being applied with, using a high-tech equipment or or in an agricultural setting that we're used to know that pesticides are applied in, it's good to be mindful that we might be able to use them as pests to control a pest, to manage a pest, and that's when they become a pesticide, right? So especially for this type of products, they're going to be found in the liquid form, so they have more of a chance to be spilled easily. And that is why it's so important that when you're handling a pesticide in your own home, to be mindful, to be wearing the correct clothing. And so we might be handling these products on a sunny day that it's hot and we're in the comfort of our own home. So we think, okay, I'm just going to wear whatever I have on and typically have a lot of parts of our body exposed. But you want to be mindful that these are still hazardous chemicals. And so you want to have access to the correct PPE. And now I'm going to talk about a couple of different examples that we may encounter. And I chose like more harsh chemicals to really send a message that, we don't need a permit to purchase this stuff. We can just go to the store and get it, but it's still a chemical and it should be treated with a sense of responsibility and and that's why we're doing this training today or this presentation today, to give you those resources and to provide you with information on how to keep yourself safe. So I was searching what is some common danger or warning type of pesticides that we can acquire at the store, and sea salt 10x weed killer came up in my search. So this is a 25B product. It's not necessarily registered through the EPA, but maybe underwent registration here in California. But it's kind of marketed as a alternative to conventional pesticides, but it's still a chemical. It's sodium chloride, and it could have up to 8% in concentration of acetic acid. So that on its own stipulates that it's a warning type of pesticide. And warning, it's so the signal words represent acute toxicity of a chemical. So typically we'll have danger, warning, and caution, right? Danger, we know it's going to be extremely toxic. A little bit of that is going to pose negative effects on a person's body. Whereas a warning doesn't mean that it's not toxic. It means that it's probably going to require a little more of that chemical to make you sick, but it's still toxic. And caution doesn't mean that they're not toxic at all. It just means that you're going to need a higher amount to feel sick, but they're extremely toxic, especially to invertebrates such as pollinators. Okay, so coming back to the sea salt 10x weed killer, it's a warning pesticide. And if you look at the safety data sheet, it stipulates that it has severe consequences if a person comes into contact with it. It causes eye irritation. It is harmful if it's inhaled. And the safety data sheet states that it should be used in a well-ventilated area, right? So that's something that maybe at the store you won't be told about, but if you go into the internet and look up the safety data sheet for this product, they will let you know that it should be used in a well-ventilated area, so never opening it in an enclosed space where you don't have enough ventilation. And obviously washing your hands thoroughly after handling. The SDS also recommends PPE. You won't find that recommendation on the container itself, but the safety data sheet does stipulate PPE recommendations. In this case, it says, we recommend that you use safety glasses, protective gloves, and use it in a area that has adequate ventilation. And you might say, okay, it's just a recommendation, it's not a requirement, but I hope that the past slides really provided you with some insight into how pesticide accidents and exposure happens and how important it is to go that extra mile in the sense of safety. Another product that, even myself, I grew up, in my parents' home and we had access to bleach, right? And obviously it was always stored in an area that kids wouldn't really get to it. But, the older I get, and now I myself have a house and do my own cleaning, you become more aware of how cleaning products are really not necessarily told to people, this is also considered a pesticide. And it's marketed as a cleaning product, but again, it kills viruses, bacteria, right? And so it is going to act as a pesticide as well. And the active ingredient is sodium hypochlorite, which it's extremely toxic chemical, and it could be that a product has up to 10% concentrate of that in the container, so highly toxic. And it does have the danger signal word, right? So that is listed on the front of the container, letting people know that it's dangerous. And just a little bit of it can make someone really sick. In addition, the safety data sheet also talks about what are those hazards, what are those potential effects that might be represented on a person. Some of these are severe eye and skin damage. It is a tract irritant, so if a person inhales it for too long, could be really doing some damage to the respiratory tract of a person. And let alone ingesting it, right? It can cause serious corrosion and of the mucous membranes, right? The insides of our body are quite delicate, so it is very severe chemical, and it must be held carefully and with lots of responsibility. And again, on the SES sheet, it even says that the person that is handling it should have access to a well-ventilated area. Obviously, the SESs are going to be listed more for a professional use setting, so it might talk about an eyewear station, but for a person that is using this in their own home, it's just having access to a sink with enough water or a source with potable water so that they can immediately rinse those eyes if they come into contact with it. And obviously access to shower that has soap and water that is really going to break down those chemicals off the skin and remove it from the skin. And it also has a recommendation for personal protective equipment. Again, I want to go back to that to those years when I was a child, and sometimes I would see my dad using it, and he wouldn't be using gloves or safety glasses, and now I'm thinking, okay, I really wish I knew all this information so that thankfully nothing bad has happened, but it's so important to have access to this resources and really be in the known how these chemicals are also dangerous. And so eye and face protection is recommended. It says here using chemical safety goggles that are sealed to the face. And it also talks about wearing protective clothing if it's going to be in a situation where the person is applying it in a huge amount, even access to boots, gloves, coveralls to protect the skin. And in some instances, depending on the situation, a NIOSH approved respirator. And I'm going to be talking about those specifics in a minute, but I want to cover other things before we talk about how to choose PPE correctly. Another product that I also found after my research that I was doing for this presentation It's the wet and forget mold and mild mildew remover. So, if this is again another like one of those harsh chemicals that are available at the store that you can purchase without a permit. And it's also going to be the active ingredient, it's alkyl dimethyl. It's so hard to pronounce, right? So we already know that it's going to be in high concentration. It has a warning signal word. And the safety data sheet again states that it has moderate eye and skin irritation. It causes severe damage to the nose, stomach, and could be even fatal if an enough amount of it is inhaled or exposed to the person. And again, the safety data sheet has another recommendation, which is to wear the safety goggles and have access to impervious material. This means, in other words, that it's chemical resistant gloves that won't allow the product to come into contact with your skin. And in some instances, even a respirator might be required. Okay. And now I want to move into what are how do people typically choose PPE? And again, this might not be applicable to your situation because you might say, well, I'm not an employee, I'm not a person working, where pesticides are applied. But just keep in mind that these regulations have been developed for that same reason, to protect people. And so if workers are protected, the same should be kind of reflected at the home as well, to protect yourself. And so typically, the way PPE is listed or required for a workplace is by following federal guidelines, which is listed on the pesticide label. And then we have state regulations from the Department of Pesticide Regulations here in California. And there are a whole entire sections of regulations and legal jargon that stipulates that personal protective equipment is required for a person that handles pesticides in their workplace. And in some instances, there might even additional regulations for workers in specific areas. And so these are the main three layers of how regulations work at the federal regulatory, federal, state, and county level. And this is something to keep in mind, right? So for a person that works at a place where pesticides are applied, or if that person is required to use pesticides, they are going to be following this different sections of requirements. But what about if you're not an employee, right? So what approach do you take? Well, we always know that with pesticides, the first step is to read the label, right? So you want to check the label. The label will provide you with lots of information. And even if it's taking you a little bit longer, it's it has its rewards. It's beneficial to have all that information prior to handling a pesticide. You also want to make sure that you're looking at the safety data sheet, which is another document that overlaps with the label in some sections, but they have different functions. The SDSs are going to provide a chemical profile on what the active ingredient is and some other specifics on what to do in case of emergency, as well as the label. And there are other resources for people that are interested in finding out what should I do. The National Pesticide Safety Education Center has lots of great information. The Pesticide Environmental Stewardship webpage also has lots of good information that have lots of different topics on pesticide safety. And if you're familiar with your county extension office from the University of California, you also might want to reach to them and ask questions, as well as always making sure that you're accessing your information from academic publications and and sources that are credible, right? To know what to do and how to or presentations and meetings such as this one where you're having access to objective information that is really going to give you those educational tools to know what PPE should I wear. Okay, so California law states that if a person works at a place where they are going to be required to handle pesticides, this person at a minimum should have access to protective eyewear and chemical resistant gloves. That is the minimum, that's the baseline, without taking into consideration the label. But typically, as I said, first you will read the label, and if the label does not state any requirements, that person will still have to have access to protective eyewear and chemical resistant gloves. If they're handling a warning or danger pesticide, they have to have access to coveralls that are resistant to chemicals as well. So eye protection, sometimes on the label, it would just say handlers must wear eye protection, and it doesn't, or protective eyewear, and it doesn't say or specify what type. But there are many different types. We have safety glasses, such as the ones we see here. We have goggles and face shield. And each one of them is going to protect the eyes, but at different levels. The safety glasses are typically these ones that look like regular glasses, but they provide front, side, and brow protection. And you want to make sure that they are Z87.1 or Z87 plus, which is the number that stipulates that they're ANSI compliant. ANSI is the American National Standards Institute, and it stipulates that these glasses are have been tested and are approved for impact resistant, for splash, like it's really protective of the eyes. Whereas the goggles are going to be a little more protective because they create a seal around your face. And so it's going to be more difficult to get anything in there. And then the face shield typically is going to protect even the whole face. So if eye protection is listed on the label, then that's an easy answer because you already know you have to wear a type of any of these. Sometimes the label would specifically say the person must wear, or the applicator must wear, goggles or face shield or goggles. In that instance, then you are required to wear safety goggles, and you can no longer wear the safety glasses because the label is specifically telling you the specific device and that and therefore you have to follow that. If the label doesn't say what type, then you're free to choose from those three. Okay, so gloves. In this picture, I typically use for trainings where I have where I'm sharing resources with professional applicators because they are going to have access to, again, much more concentrated pesticides that are restricted use, and so they might have to use different types of chemical resistant materials. Typically on a pesticide application that it's happening at a home, that if it's ready to use a product, you're going to have access to a nitrile glove that is 14 mils or thicker. Those materials are going to ensure that no chemical trespasses that material, and therefore your skin is going to be completely protected. The nitrile disposable gloves are those that we find at the doctor's office or that we might have at home. These are also protected, but they're not chemical resistant, right? So they're probably can drip easily and then end up with the exposed skin, and you don't really use them for chemical applications. And for professional use pesticides, on the label, it will typically state a label code. So it may say something along the lines of handlers and applicators must wear label code A material gloves. And if you don't know what that is, the DPR, Department of Pesticide Regulation, has a selection key which decodifies what that material is. For label code A, it's going to be all of the materials listed on this side, right? So laminate, butyl, nitrile, neoprene, natural, polyethylene, PVC, and Viton. Natural does not stand for natural like cotton or leather. It stands for natural rubber. Okay, so gloves such as this ones that we use for gardening are not protective against chemicals. They are going to absorb that material, so just keep that in mind. And it's also another common violation that inspectors find in work settings where handlers are saying, wait a minute, I'm wearing gloves, I'm protecting myself, but they're made out of cotton, canvas, or leather, and so that's not really protecting against chemicals. And then we have coveralls. So coveralls are going to be another protective device that is obviously going to enclose most of your body, and you know when to wear them, specifically in a workplace if they're stated on the label. If you're handling danger or warning pesticides, so those are the base guidelines. However, we recommend that if the handler or the person that is applying a pesticide is going to be coming into contact with a pesticide, danger warning, they should, with a spray, they should be wearing it. Typically for like landscape professionals or in some agricultural settings, this may be the case. And then I'm going to be providing some specific examples later on how it might be applicable for a home resident, but as long as you're wearing long pants, long sleeves, you're already covering yourself for those ready-to-use products. The coveralls tend to be more applicable for professional use pesticides, but I will provide some specifics on that. Okay, so another component of PPE, another device, is the ones that we saw earlier. It's not only going to be gloves, glasses, and coveralls, but also in some instances, the person might have to have, might require access to a respirator. Respirators are devices that are used to protect the person from inhaling dangerous substances such as chemicals and infectious particles, and there are several types. We have a particular respirators, which we became very familiar with during the pandemic. And these are going to protect against those airborne particles, right? Whereas the gas mask respirators that protect against vapors are going to be a little more intricate and detailed. We also have power air purifying respirators, and these are typically used in settings where the air is so contaminated or so toxic that the person can't, wear just a regular particular respirator. They're going to have access to a more intricate example, such as the one we see here, like the self-contained breathing apparatus, which I think is typically used by some firemen in some instances. So the particulate respirators are known as the N95s, for example, and they are respirators because they are certified by the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, NIOSH, and they will have typically a letter or a filter efficiency that characterizes them as respirators. These only, as I said earlier, they only protect against airborne particles, so like viruses, but they do not protect against larger particles like gas or vapors. And Their respirator, because I said they're certified by NIOSH, they will have typically a lettering such as NRP, which stipulates the resistance to oil degradation. And they also have a filter efficiency of 99, 99, or 100%. For the chemical cartridge gas respirators or mask respirators, gas mask respirators, these are going to protect against vapors, dust, larger particles, and they will have more technical specifications, and they also follow the NRP classification for filtering oils. And so for respirators are going to depend on the situation of the application. If a person is required to wear a respirator, it's typically going to be listed on the label. And if it's required by a state safety regulation, or if it's employer policy. And so I know that people that apply fumigants in fields or structures, they are required to have a respirator, but a respirator is going to follow, in the workplace is going to follow a respirator program, which entails medical evaluation, a fit test, and it's a very detailed set of requirements for a person to wear a respirator at the workplace. If it's a voluntary provision where the person wants to wear a respirator because they want an extra layer of protection, they need to keep in mind that respirators have to be fitted because they need to be sealed around the mouth, right? So that there is no particles coming in that haven't been filtered out. And so it's always important if a person has to take in consideration chronic respiratory, cardiac, or other medical conditions that could make breathing difficult. They should be consulting with a doctor prior to using a very intricate respirator. The N95s, as we all know, those are particulate against particular respirators. So those do form a seal around the person's mouth, but they are not as intricate as a gas mask or one of those self-containing breathing apparatus. Okay, so now that I talked about, I gave you like a very technical aspect of PPE, we're going to talk about more of what to do at home if you were to be handling harsher chemical. As we said in our earlier examples, sea salt 10x weed killer is a material that you can buy at a convenience store such as Ace or Home Depot, and not necessarily it might be marketed as safe and not as a toxic pesticide, but like we said, it does have acetic acid in it, and it could still be cause irritation and problems to the person. So they recommend safety glasses. In this instance, we really would recommend that you buy safety glasses and not just wear sunglasses or your seeing glasses, for example, because you want to make sure that they are protecting front, brow, and temple sides in case of a spill, as well as protective gloves. And so the gloves are going to be your nitrile gloves that are 14 mils or thicker that you can purchase in any store as well. And that would really provide a layer of protection against this product, even if it's ready to use and you really are not going to be handling or diluting it or doing some crazy application, you're still going to be protected from that chemical in case of a spill or just any accidents that may happen or indirectly exposing yourself to that, as well as handling it in a area that has adequate ventilation, right? So you don't want to be opening this type of product in an enclosed area where ventilation is not really available, and so that could be posing those risks that we talked about earlier. But before we finish for the next minute, I really want to focus on what about bleach, right? So bleach is going to depend. Some of it is going to be very high concentration, some of it is going to be more diluted. But if you're going to be dealing with a harsh, like high concentration for any reason, you want to have access to safety goggles, even if it's annoying, because again, right, you want to protect yourself against any spills or and having access to chemical resistant gloves. The coveralls, it's really gonna depend again on the concentration. I would recommend wearing them if you're gonna have access to a very like industrial concentration type of bleach. But if you're gonna be dealing with just a more diluted version, then you probably just want to have your typical long sleeve, long pants. And it says here on the SDS that a NIOSH approved respirator might be needed. However, that might not be the case always. It's again, it really is going to depend on how harsh the chemical is. And before we go, I wanted to show this very brief video of a person removing their PPE and why it's so important to have proper decontamination protocol is because, you know, if you don't wash your gloves before removing them, you're going to end up introducing residues to your face or to other areas. So just as a last minute message, washing your gloves after an application before removing them, it's very important. And then making sure that the last thing you remove are those gloves, because you want to remove your shoes or you want to remove anything else that might come into contact with a pesticide. The last thing to be removed should be the gloves. And then you can wash your hands with soap and water. And just keeping in mind that wearing personal protective equipment, overall, it's more of a benefit than a hassle. And always read the label. And if you have doubts, make sure that you're accessing all the resources that are available to you. And PPE protects you from exposure to pesticides. So with that, I believe that's my time. And hopefully, I'm sorry about the end, it was a little bit rushed, but if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. This is my contact information. Our pesticide safety education program has an Instagram, so if you want to give us a follow, we appreciate that as well. This is my email, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Jasmine. That was a great presentation.